Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we'll be wandering back through time, across windswept plains and endless horizons, to the story of a man whose name still echoes across history, Genghis Khan. He was born into obscurity, a child of the cold Mongolian steppe, with no crown, no riches, and no certainty of survival. Yet from those humble beginnings, he rose to command the largest land empire the world has ever seen. His life was marked by danger and resilience, betrayal and loyalty, destruction and creation. He united warring tribes, redrew the map of continents, and set in motion exchanges of culture and knowledge that shaped the modern world. If you enjoy these journeys through time, you can always like the video and subscribe, or leave a comment down below. But for now, settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let the steppe winds carry you back in time. Let's begin. He began life as Temujin, a child left to starve on the steppe. The boy who would become Genghis Khan was not born into power or wealth. His name at birth was Temujin, and his family belonged to a small, struggling tribe on the vast Mongolian steppe. After his father's death, the clan that once supported them abandoned the family, leaving Temujin, his mother, and his siblings to survive alone in a landscape where even the strong could perish. The winds were harsh, food was scarce, and enemies circled nearby. Yet this hardship became the forge that shaped his resilience. The boy who once wandered the plains with little more than hunger in his stomach would one day build the largest land empire in human history. The contrast between the starving child and the ruler he became makes his story one of the most extraordinary transformations the world has ever known. A blood clot in his tiny fist at birth was seen as a sign he would rule. According to Mongol legend, Temujin was born holding a blood clot tightly in his fist. Among his people, such a sign was thought to foretell destiny, suggesting that the child would grow to be a great leader or warrior. Whether this detail is literal truth or an embellished memory, it reveals something about how his story was remembered by those who followed him. From the very beginning, his life was framed as marked by fate, as if the universe had chosen him for greatness. In cultures across the world, unusual births often carried prophetic meaning, and this story placed Temujin in that tradition. For the Mongols who later told and retold his life, the detail of the blood clot became more than a curiosity. It was an omen. A child who began life with such a sign was never going to be ordinary. His name came from a warrior his father had defeated. Temujin's unusual name carried the memory of conflict. His father, Yesugei, captured a rival Tatar warrior while out raiding. That prisoner's name was Temujin, and the infant son born around the same time was given the same name. The story is a reminder of how violence and rivalry shaped even the earliest details of Genghis Khan's life. A name born from the spoils of war may have seemed fitting for a child destined to live in a world of tribal feuds, shifting alliances, and constant danger. Later in life, Temujin would abandon his birth name for the far grander title of Genghis Khan, universal ruler. But the memory of his childhood name lingers, tying his story back to the fierce battles of the steppe. It is striking to think that the man who would conquer half the world began life carrying the name of a defeated enemy. His father was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a boy. Yesugei, Temujin's father, was a tribal leader who relied on shifting alliances to keep his family safe. While traveling, he accepted food from members of the rival Tatar tribe, but the meal was poisoned. Soon after, he died, leaving his young son without protection. For the Mongols, loyalty was fragile, and enemies often used cunning instead of direct battle. Temujin, still only a boy, suddenly found himself without the shield of a father's power. This single act set in motion years of hardship. Without Yesugei, the family was vulnerable, and their clan quickly abandoned them. The poisoning not only robbed a child of his parent, but also changed the destiny of the steppe. If Yasuge had lived, Temujin's path might have been very different. Instead, loss forced him to grow quickly in a world where betrayal was often the rule, not the exception. His family was abandoned, forced to survive on wild roots and fish. After his father's death, Temujin's family was cast out by their tribe. On the steppe, survival depended on numbers, and a widow with young children offered little value in the harsh economy of loyalty and strength. Suddenly alone, the family was left with no herds, no support, and no protection. They scraped by on what little nature offered: roots dug from the ground, berries, small animals, and fish pulled from rivers. It was a life of constant hunger, where each day's survival was uncertain. For a future ruler, these years of deprivation shaped a mindset of resilience and adaptability. He knew the taste of poverty, the ache of an empty stomach, and the fear of being defenseless. This memory of abandonment would stay with him, fueling his later determination to gather allies and build a power strong enough, but no family of his own would ever face such a fate again. He killed his own half-brother in a fight over food. In the brutal conditions of his youth, even family ties could snap under the strain of hunger. Temujin's half-brother, Bektar, competed with him for scarce resources. The tension escalated until the teenage Temujin, along with his full brother, decided to eliminate the rival within their own household. Bektar was killed, a shocking act that revealed both the desperation of their situation and the ruthless streak that survival demanded. Among the Mongols, leadership often came through force, and even within families, dominance had to be asserted. For Temujin, this moment foreshadowed a life in which loyalty and betrayal, kinship and rivalry would constantly overlap. Though grim, it was a decisive early lesson. To survive and lead in a world of scarcity, one had to make brutal choices. Later, as Genghis Khan, he would channel that same ruthlessness on a far larger stage. As a child, he learned to hunt by trapping small animals. The young Temujin grew up without the wealth of herds that sustained most Mongol families. Instead, he had to improvise, learning to trap and hunt in order to keep himself and his siblings alive. Birds, small mammals, and fish became the staples of his survival diet. This early necessity taught him skills of patience, strategy, and resourcefulness. On the open steppe, knowing how to feed yourself could mean the difference between life and death. While other children of noble families practiced riding with abundant support, Temujin was sharpening the instincts of a survivor. These experiences formed a foundation of toughness that would carry into adulthood. By the time he commanded vast armies, he understood hardship intimately. He had lived it. That knowledge allowed him to inspire soldiers who also came from humble backgrounds, uniting them under a leader who knew hunger as well as glory. Rivals once locked him in a heavy wooden slave collar. As a boy, Temujin was captured by enemies and made into a slave. To mark his status, they placed a heavy wooden collar around his neck. The device was meant to humiliate, to remind him and everyone who saw him that he was powerless. But captivity did not break him. Even as a prisoner, he looked for ways to endure and to escape. The wooden collar was not just a physical weight, it was a symbol of defeat. Yet in later years, he turned the memory into fuel. The boy who once stumbled under the burden of forced servitude would one day lead millions. His story of slavery and escape became part of the legend that others told about him, proof that even those born into humiliation could rise to unimaginable power. The collar meant to confine him became the memory that set him free. He escaped thanks to a guard who risked his own life to free him. While enslaved, Temujin's fate seemed sealed, but then came an unexpected act of compassion. A guard, moved by pity or perhaps impressed by the boy's spirit, helped him escape. The details vary in different accounts, but what stands out is that one man's choice altered the course of history. If that guard had not taken the risk, the future Genghis Khan might have lived and died unknown, just another forgotten prisoner. Instead, Temujin broke free and carried the memory of that kindness with him. Later, he would be known for punishing betrayal harshly, but also for rewarding loyalty and mercy when he saw it. The anonymous guard who freed him may never have known what his act would unleash, but it set into motion the rise of a leader who would transform half the known world. He married Bert when he was still a teenager. Marriage was a vital alliance on the Mongolian steppe, and for Temujin, it was also a turning point. He wed Bert, a young woman from a neighboring tribe, while still a teenager. Their bond was both personal and political, linking his family to her clan. Bert would remain central throughout his life, not just as his wife, but as a figure of loyalty and strength. Their marriage was soon tested when she was kidnapped by rivals, a crisis that forced Temujin to rally allies and raise an army for the first time. The rescue of Bert was more than the saving of a wife. It was the event that marked the beginning of his career as a commander. From this moment, his private life and his public destiny became inseparable, showing how even the most personal choices could spark the rise of an empire. Soon after, Bert was kidnapped by the Merkit tribe. Not long after their marriage, Bert was seized by raiders from the rival Merkit tribe. To the nomadic peoples of the steppe, women were sometimes taken as trophies in war or as a way to weaken alliances. For Temujin, it was not just the loss of his wife, but an attack on his family's honor and survival. Bert's abduction became one of the most painful moments of his early life and one of the most important turning points. The experience tested him in ways nothing else had before. In a world where strength meant everything, a kidnapping of a wife was both personal humiliation and political defeat. Yet Temujin did not accept it as fate. Instead, he resolved to act, setting in motion the first campaign of his life. In trying to reclaim Bert, he would also begin to reclaim his destiny. Temujin raised an army to rescue her, his first taste of command. The rescue of Bert required more than courage, it demanded alliances. Temujin appealed to his childhood blood brother Jamukha and to his father's ally, Togrul, a powerful Khan. With their support, he gathered warriors and marched against the Merkit. It was his first time commanding an army, his first test of leadership on the battlefield. Against the odds, the campaign succeeded, and Bert was returned to him. The event marked the beginning of Temujin's reputation as a leader who could act decisively and inspire loyalty. For his companions, this was not just a rescue but a demonstration of his potential. In rescuing his wife, Temujin discovered the power of assembling followers under a cause. It was the earliest glimpse of the commander he would one day become, a man capable of leading thousands, and eventually millions, across the vast landscapes of Asia. His rescued wife later gave birth to his first son. After Bert returned, she gave birth to a son named Jochi. The child's paternity became a subject of controversy, since Bert had been held by the Merkit before her rescue. Some whispered doubts about whether Jochi was truly Temugin's blood. Yet Temujin accepted Jochi as his own, raising him as the eldest of his heirs. This choice revealed something striking about his character. In a culture where lineage and loyalty were tightly bound, Temujin placed unity above suspicion. Though rivals would later use the question of Jochi's birth to try to sow division among his family, Temujin's acceptance of the boy helped preserve stability in his household. For a man building power out of fragile alliances, this decision showed a rare pragmatism. Whatever the truth, Jochi became an important commander, and Temujin's trust in him reflected the wider strategy of forging strength from uncertainty. Temujin forged alliances with other Khans through sworn brotherhoods. On the steppe, alliances were often sealed not just with words, but with solemn rituals. Temujin entered into Anda relationships, sacred bonds of sworn brotherhood. Two men who became Anda pledged to treat one another as family, sharing loyalty beyond ordinary friendship. These alliances gave him powerful partners in a world where betrayal was common and survival often depended on trust. Some of his most important early gains came from these bonds, allowing him to gather men and resources he could never have commanded alone. Yet sworn brotherhoods could also falter, as ambition and rivalry tested their strength. For Temujin, the Anda rituals revealed both the possibilities and the dangers of loyalty on the steppe. While some brotherhoods strengthened his rise, others collapsed, leaving scars that would shape his later campaigns. Even so, the practice showed how deeply personal ties could shape the fate of empires. One blood brother later betrayed him in battle. Among Temujin's sworn brothers, none was more significant than Jamuka. At first, they were inseparable, united by vows of loyalty. Together, they dreamed of leading the Mongols. But ambition soon drove them apart. Jamuka turned against Temujin, rallying tribes to his side, and eventually leading a massive force against his former friend. In one of their early clashes, Jamuka's army inflicted terrible losses on Temujin's smaller band of followers. What made the betrayal sting most was not simply defeat, but the collapse of trust. A bond once considered sacred had become a rivalry drenched in blood. For Temujin, the lesson was unforgettable. Even brotherhood sealed by ritual could fracture under the weight of ambition. The betrayal hardened him, teaching him never to rely too completely on personal ties, and to build power instead on discipline, law, and structures that could not be undone by friendship's failure. He destroyed old traditions by promoting men for merit, not birth. Mongol society had long been shaped by aristocratic clans. Leadership was usually inherited, and privilege passed through bloodlines. Temujin shattered this tradition. He raised men to positions of command based on talent, loyalty, and skill, not noble ancestry. A shepherd who proved brave in battle might rise above an aristocrat who relied only on birth. This meritocratic approach was radical in its time and transformed his following into something new. Warriors began to see him not just as another Khan, but as a leader who rewarded ability. It allowed him to attract ambitious men who might otherwise have been overlooked. The system also gave his armies a sharper edge, filled with commanders who had earned their positions. By breaking with the past, Temujin created a foundation for an empire that would value discipline and achievement over tradition, making his forces both innovative and fiercely loyal. Common herders could rise to the rank of general under his rule. For ordinary Mongols, Temujin's rise offered a rare opportunity. In earlier generations, birth had determined destiny. A herder might spend his whole life tending animals, never rising in status no matter his courage. Under Temujin, this changed. A man who showed loyalty and skill could climb to positions of extraordinary authority. Some of his most trusted generals began as commoners, rising through the ranks to lead thousands of warriors. This shift not only rewarded talent, but also inspired deep loyalty among his followers. Soldiers fought fiercely, knowing their futures were not fixed by lineage, but by deeds. In this way, Temujin reshaped Mongol society, offering upward nobility that bound common men to his cause. The promise of advancement created an army of devoted warriors who believed their leader offered something new, a path to greatness through service and ability. He banned the kidnapping and selling of women. On the steppe, women were often treated as property, taken in raids or traded as goods. Temujin outlawed such practices within his realm. The kidnapping of women, once an accepted custom, became a crime under his authority. This was not only a personal stance, perhaps shaped by the abduction of Bert, but also a way to stabilize his growing power. Families could trust that their daughters and wives would be safer under his rule, making his leadership more appealing. While his empire was still deeply patriarchal, this change represented a significant departure from older customs. It showed that Temujin was willing to challenge tradition when it suited his vision of order. The protection of women from abduction reinforced loyalty among his people and added to his reputation as a leader who offered not only strength in war, but also fairness in law. He outlawed the enslavement of Mongols. Slavery was a constant risk for those living on the steppe. Captured in raids or battles, people could be forced into bondage by rivals. Temujin ended this practice for his own people, declaring that no Mongol could be enslaved by another. This decree strengthened unity among his followers, ensuring that loyalty was not undermined by the threat of internal exploitation. By abolishing Mongol slavery, he created a stronger collective identity. To be Mongol was to be free. The rule also encouraged more men to rally to his cause, knowing that their families would not face the fate that Temujin himself had once suffered in his youth. Having worn the collar of a slave as a boy, he knew the humiliation firsthand. By outlawing it, he set his authority apart from older Khans and made freedom a defining feature of his leadership. His empire guaranteed religious freedom to all faiths. One of Temujin's most remarkable policies was his insistence on religious tolerance. Within his empire lived Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, and traditional shamans, all practicing freely. Instead of imposing a single faith, he allowed each to worship without interference. Religious leaders were often exempted from taxation, and temples, mosques, and churches alike received protection. This approach had practical benefits. It reduced unrest and allowed him to rule over a vast, diverse population. But it also reflected a deep pragmatism. For Temujin, loyalty and order mattered more than doctrine. By embracing tolerance, he created stability across lands where religious conflict might otherwise have divided people. In an age when many rulers demanded conformity, his policy stood out as strikingly modern. The empire of Genghis Khan became one of the most religiously diverse and surprisingly tolerant realms of the medieval world. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and shamans all lived under his rule. The empire of Genghis Khan stretched across lands filled with different beliefs. Within its borders, mosques, temples, churches, and shrines all stood side by side. Muslim merchants prayed toward Mecca, Buddhist monks chanted in monasteries, Christians built churches, and shamans carried out rituals beneath the open sky. Instead of crushing these differences, Genghis Khan allowed them to continue, provided loyalty to his rule was maintained. This diversity made his empire unique for its time. In Europe and the Middle East, wars of religion often tore societies apart. Yet under the Mongols, faith itself was not the dividing line. People could remain who they were and still be part of something larger. For a man often remembered only for conquest, this aspect of his rule shows another side, one where tolerance served as a foundation for stability, binding together millions who would otherwise have remained divided. He created a law code known as the Yasa. The legal foundation of Genghis Khan's empire was called the Yasa. Unlike earlier traditions, which varied by tribe, the Yasa was intended to apply across all Mongol domains. It covered everything from military discipline to family behavior, trade, and even environmental rules, such as bans on polluting water sources. The Yasa was partly secret, passed down among Mongol leaders, and never written in full for outsiders. This air of mystery added to its authority, making it both feared and respected. What is clear is that the Yasa unified the diverse peoples of the empire under a single system of order. It embodied Genghis Khan's belief that strength did not come only from horses and arrows, but from law that all had to obey. For subjects spread from the Pacific to Persia, the Yasa created a sense of shared rules that stretched across half the known world. Theft of livestock was punished by death under the Yasa. On the Mongolian steppe, herds were life itself. Horses, sheep, and goats provided food, clothing, transport, and survival. To steal an animal was to steal a family's future. Under the Yasa, livestock theft was one of the gravest crimes, and the punishment was death. The severity may seem extreme, but it reflected the values of a society where herds were everything. By enforcing such a strict rule, Genghis Khan ensured stability among his people. Families could rest knowing their animals were safer, and warriors could trust that their property would not vanish while they were away campaigning. The rule also reinforced discipline among the Mongols themselves. An empire that punished even small crimes harshly could not tolerate betrayal or corruption at higher levels. In protecting animals, Genghis Khan also protected the social fabric that allowed his vast realm to endure and expand. His system protected envoys. Killing one was unforgivable. Diplomats and messengers held a sacred place under Genghis Khan's law. The Yasa declared that envoys were inviolable, no matter where they came from or what news they carried. To harm one was considered an attack on the Khan himself. This principle was more than symbolic. When the ruler of the Khwarezm Empire killed Mongol envoys, it triggered one of Genghis Khan's fiercest campaigns of revenge, in which the entire Khwarezm state was destroyed. By elevating envoys to untouchable status, he made diplomacy possible across a vast empire and beyond. Even enemies could send word without fear of their messengers being harmed. In an age when betrayal was common, this rule made communication more reliable. It was a reminder that, in his world, words carried power equal to weapons, and that breaking the rules of diplomacy could invite destruction. His empire built the safest trade routes the Silk Road had ever seen. For centuries, the Silk Road had connected east and west, but it was also notoriously dangerous. Bandits, warring states, and treacherous terrain made long journeys perilous. Under Genghis Khan, this changed. His armies secured thousands of miles of trade routes, bringing a level of stability previously unknown. Merchants could move goods across deserts, mountains, and grasslands with a far greater sense of safety. The result was a flourishing of commerce that connected distant civilizations more directly than ever before. Chinese silk and porcelain, Middle Eastern glass and European silver all moved along the same arteries of trade. Knowledge traveled as well, from medical practices to technologies. The Mongol peace, known as the Pax Mongolica, was as much an achievement of Genghis Khan as his conquests. For the first time, vast regions of the world were tied together not just by war, but by trade. Merchants traveled thousands of miles under Mongol protection. The reach of Genghis Khan's empire meant that a trader could start a journey in China and carry goods as far as Persia, Russia, or even the edge of Europe without leaving Mongol-controlled lands. Patrols and fortified stations ensured that caravans moved safely, and harsh penalties awaited anyone who dared to attack them. This system encouraged commerce on a scale the world had rarely seen before. It was said that a woman carrying gold could travel unarmed from one end of the empire to the other without fear. This may be an exaggeration, but it speaks to the sense of security his rule created. The result was not just an exchange of goods, but also of cultures. Languages, religions, and ideas crossed borders with ease. The empire that began with the unification of steppe tribes became the backbone of global trade in the medieval world. His postal system stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. One of Genghis Khan's most practical innovations was the creation of a vast communication network. This system, often compared to a medieval version of the postal service, linked distant parts of his empire from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Known as the Yam, it relied on relay stations placed a day's ride apart. Couriers could change horses and continue almost without pause, allowing messages to travel at astonishing speeds for the age. Orders from the Khan could reach commanders thousands of miles away in just a few days. The system also carried intelligence, trade information, and even supplies. For the Mongols, who valued speed and coordination, the Yam was a secret weapon as important as their cavalry. It bound together a territory so vast that, without it, ruling would have been nearly impossible. Relay stations provided fresh horses for lightning-fast couriers. At the heart of the Mongol communication system were the relay stations. Each was stocked with horses, food, and shelter for messengers. A courier could arrive exhausted, switch to a fresh mount, and be on the road again within minutes. In this way, messages and goods could move hundreds of miles in a matter of days, far outpacing the speed of any rival state. The stations also created a rhythm of security along the roads. Merchants and travelers could find shelter there, and soldiers stationed nearby deterred bandits. For the Mongol administration, the system was invaluable. It gave Genghis Khan eyes and ears across his vast realm and allowed him to respond quickly to any threat. The relay network was one of the first large-scale logistical systems in history, a forerunner of the modern postal services and supply chains that move our world today. His empire spurred inventions like paper, printing, and gunpowder. The conquests of Genghis Khan did more than redraw maps. They accelerated the exchange of knowledge. As his armies moved, they carried technologies and ideas from one culture to another. Chinese inventions like paper, woodblock printing, and gunpowder reached the Middle East and Europe through Mongol channels. In return, advances in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics flowed eastward. While warfare brought destruction, it also created a single connected world where ideas could travel faster than ever before. The spread of gunpowder would eventually transform European warfare, while printing laid groundwork for revolutions in communication. Few conquerors in history had such an indirect but profound effect on global progress. The empire of Genghis Khan became a vast highway, not just for horses and armies, but for human knowledge itself. He introduced paper money across vast regions. Among the many innovations carried by the Mongols was the adoption of paper money. In lands where coinage had long dominated, paper notes provided a lighter, more flexible way to conduct trade. Introduced from Chinese models, paper currency spread across vast stretches of Asia under Mongol authority. For merchants, this change simplified long-distance exchange. Instead of transporting heavy metal coins, they could carry stamped paper backed by the authority of the Khan. The move also demonstrated Genghis Khan's willingness to embrace useful ideas from conquered lands. Practical, efficient, and enforceable by law, paper money became one of the many ways his empire knit together regions that had once been isolated. It was a glimpse of the modern economy emerging centuries before such practices became widespread in Europe. In the markets of the Mongol Empire, the paper of the future was already in use. His conquests connected China, the Middle East, and Europe. Before Genghis Khan, the great civilizations of Eurasia were separated by distance, war, and dangerous trade routes. His campaigns forced those worlds together. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China through Central Asia, Persia, and into the edges of Europe. Goods that had once trickled slowly across borders now moved under the protection of a single ruler. Alongside them traveled ideas, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophies, blending cultures that had rarely touched before. For the first time in history, merchants and travelers could cross continents within the borders of one empire. Though the empire often expanded through violence, the result was an unprecedented degree of connection. In many ways, Genghis Khan created the first global network, a prototype for later centuries of trade and cultural exchange. The Silk Road had existed for centuries, but under the Mongols, it flourished as never before. Genghis Khan united tribes who had feuded for centuries. The Mongolian steppe was long divided by tribal rivalries. Families fought over grazing lands, water, and herds, passing down hatred from one generation to the next. Temujin changed this landscape of endless conflict. By combining diplomacy, marriage alliances, and military force, he drew together clans that had never stood side by side. Some joined willingly, impressed by his leadership and fairness. Others were defeated in battle and then absorbed into his growing confederation. What made his unification remarkable was that it went beyond temporary truces. He replaced fragile tribal customs with a new order based on loyalty to him personally, rather than to ancient bloodlines. In time, he transformed fractious nomads into a single, unstoppable force. The unity of the Mongols was not just a political success, it was the foundation on which the world's largest empire would be built. He was elected Khan of all Mongols at a great tribal council. Around the year 1206, Temujin gathered the tribes that had sworn loyalty to him. At a grand assembly known as a Kurultai, he was formally elected leader of the Mongols. This was not just a title, it was a public declaration that the scattered tribes of the steppe now had one supreme chief. The event symbolized the transformation of Temujin from a local warlord into a leader of a nation. In Mongol culture, the Kurultai carried great weight, as it reflected the consensus of tribal elders and warriors. By receiving their recognition, he gained legitimacy that went beyond force. The title Khan of all Mongols meant he had achieved what countless leaders before him had failed to do: unify the fractious steppe into a single political body. From this moment forward, his destiny expanded to match the scale of his ambition. The title Genghis Khan meant universal ruler. When Temujin took the name Genghis Khan, he chose a title with sweeping meaning. Translations vary, but the most common interpretation is universal ruler or oceanic ruler, suggesting power without boundaries. It was not the name of a mere tribal chief, but of a man who claimed authority over all peoples, everywhere. By taking it, he announced that his ambitions were not limited to Mongolia alone. The title itself was a statement of intent, a declaration to friend and foe alike that his vision stretched across horizons. The world may not have recognized him at first, but the Mongols who followed him believed. The new name carried both awe and fear, echoing across the steppe. In the centuries that followed, it would become one of the most recognizable titles in all of history, forever linked with conquest, ambition, and extraordinary power. He inspired both fear and loyalty across Asia. To his enemies, Genghis Khan was a figure of terror. Tales of entire cities destroyed, of populations scattered, and of armies annihilated traveled far ahead of his horsemen. The fear alone was often enough to make towns surrender without resistance. But to his followers, he inspired a different feeling, loyalty so deep that men were willing to ride thousands of miles at his command. He rewarded bravery, protected his warriors' families, and shared the spoils of victory fairly. In a world where leaders often hoarded wealth for themselves, this fairness made him stand out. Fear spread his reputation to strangers, loyalty secured his power among his people. Together, the two emotions created a force that few rulers could match. It was this duality, terrifying enemy, beloved leader, that allowed him to hold together an empire of staggering size. His horsemen could cover more than 100 miles in a single day. The speed of the Mongol cavalry astonished their enemies. Riding tough steppe ponies, warriors could travel incredible distances without pause. In a single day, they could cover more than 100 miles, far more than the heavily armored knights of Europe or the infantry-based armies of China. This speed made them unpredictable and nearly impossible to stop. They could vanish from one battlefield and appear on another days away before opponents had time to react. The secret lay in their methods. Each warrior maintained several horses and switched mounts frequently to prevent exhaustion. With supplies carried lightly and herds traveling with them, Mongol armies seemed to flow across the land like rivers. For enemies used to slower campaigns, the Mongols were a nightmare of sudden appearances. Speed was their greatest weapon, turning distance, once a barrier, into a devastating advantage. Warriors sometimes drank horse blood for survival on long rides. The endurance of Mongol horsemen came not just from their animals, but from their own resourcefulness. On especially long marches, when food was scarce and the steppe offered little, they sometimes drew blood from their horses to drink. A small cut in a vein allowed enough blood to sustain them, while leaving the animal alive and still strong enough to ride. To outsiders, this practice seemed shocking, but for the Mongols, it was simply another form of survival. It reflected the deep bond between rider and horse, where both shared the hardships of endless travel. By relying on their animals in such a way, Mongol warriors extended their endurance far beyond that of any rival. It was a reminder of the harshness of their homeland, and how those lessons of survival became unmatched strengths on the battlefield. Silk shirts were worn under armor to make arrows easier to pull out. Among the practical innovations of the Mongols was their use of silk as a kind of hidden armor. Warriors often wore silk shirts beneath their leather or metal armor. When struck by an arrow, the silk fibers did not tear easily. Instead, they wrapped around the arrowhead, preventing it from cutting deeply into flesh. This made it far easier to remove the arrow, often without causing further damage. The tactic combined the luxury of silk with the grim realities of war. To their enemies, it was yet another sign of Mongol ingenuity, simple, effective, and unexpected. In the chaos of battle, a wounded warrior who could quickly remove an arrow stood a far better chance of surviving. Silk became not only a trade good but a life-saving tool, woven into the very fabric of Mongol military success. His armies could move faster than any force of their age. The mobility of Genghis Khan's armies was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Where most armies dragged heavy baggage trains, the Mongols traveled light. Herds of animals provided food and milk, while spare horses gave riders unmatched stamina. The organization of his forces into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 made them highly adaptable. They could split apart, move separately, and reunite with precision. Enemies who expected long sieges or slow advances were shocked to find Mongol armies descending on them weeks or even months earlier than expected. This ability to move swiftly across vast distances turned the empire into a storm that seemed to come from nowhere. In a world where information traveled slowly, the Mongols used speed as their deadliest weapon, ensuring their enemies were always one step behind. Entire cities surrendered without a fight when his banners appeared. By the height of his power, the reputation of Genghis Khan was enough to win victories before a single arrow was fired. Word of massacres, swift conquests, and unstoppable armies spread across Asia. When his banners appeared on the horizon, many cities chose surrender over resistance. The logic was simple. Those who fought and lost often faced destruction, while those who yielded early were spared. This strategy created a cycle. The more cities surrendered, the more terrifying his reputation became. In some cases, entire populations opened their gates, hoping to preserve lives and property. For Genghis Khan, this was victory at its most efficient. Without lifting a sword, he gained wealth, soldiers, and territory. The surrender of cities showed that his power extended beyond battlefields. It lived in the minds of his enemies, where fear itself became a weapon. Psychological warfare was one of his greatest weapons. Genghis Khan understood that fear could travel faster than horses. He carefully cultivated a reputation for unstoppable ferocity, ensuring that news of his victories spread ahead of his armies. Stories of entire cities destroyed or of enemies crushed without mercy frightened towns into surrender before a single arrow was loosed. He sometimes exaggerated the size of his forces or staged terrifying spectacles, knowing that imagination could be as deadly as steel. This psychological warfare saved time and lives, at least on his side, because opponents often gave up without fighting. It also amplified his power far beyond the battlefield. Even distant rulers trembled at the thought of facing him, their imaginations filling in horrors greater than any reality. By weaponizing fear itself, Genghis Khan turned rumor and reputation into strategic tools, winning wars before they even began. He used false retreats to lure enemies into ambushes. One of the most famous Mongol tactics was the feigned retreat. In battle, his warriors might pretend to break and flee, scattering in apparent panic. Enemy forces, believing victory was within reach, pursued them eagerly. Then, at the signal, the Mongols would turn, regroup, and attack from multiple sides. The tactic was devastating, exploiting the arrogance and overconfidence of rivals. It required extraordinary discipline because soldiers had to resist the natural urge to actually flee. Only highly trained and loyal troops could execute it convincingly. Time and again, opponents fell into the trap, only to find themselves surrounded and destroyed. For Genghis Khan, this maneuver was more than clever trickery. It was the perfect expression of his style of war, fast, deceptive, and ruthlessly efficient. Few armies of the medieval world ever learned to resist it. Mongol scouts mapped enemy lands with precision. Before launching campaigns, Genghis Khan relied on an extensive network of scouts. These men rode deep into enemy territory, gathering intelligence on terrain, resources, and defenses. They counted soldiers, measured supplies, and sometimes disguised themselves to slip inside cities. Maps and knowledge were as important to him as arrows and horses. By the time his main army arrived, he often knew the land better than its defenders. This preparation allowed him to strike with uncanny accuracy, avoiding traps and exploiting weaknesses. Enemies frequently underestimated the thoroughness of Mongol reconnaissance, thinking their lands were too vast or too remote to be fully studied. But Genghis Khan's scouts left little to chance. Their work turned a chaotic battlefield into something more like a carefully prepared game board, with every move planned in advance. Intelligence, not just brute force, helped him conquer empires. Captured enemies were sometimes forced to march ahead as shields. In some battles, Genghis Khan used the grim tactic of forcing captured enemies to march at the front of his armies. These unwilling human shields absorbed the first blows of battle, protecting the Mongol warriors behind them. For defenders, it created a terrible dilemma. To fire on the advancing line meant killing their own people, yet to hold back invited destruction. The tactic showed the ruthless pragmatism of Mongol warfare, where efficiency often outweighed mercy. It also served as psychological warfare, demoralizing those inside besieged cities by showing the powerlessness of their captured comrades. While shocking to later generations, this method reflected the brutal logic of medieval war. For Genghis Khan, every advantage mattered, and even prisoners could become tools in his relentless pursuit of victory. To his enemies, it was yet another reason to fear and surrender rather than resist. He employed Chinese engineers to build massive siege weapons. The Mongols were masters of mobility on open plains, but when faced with fortified cities, they turned to science and engineering. After conquering Chinese lands, Genghis Khan recruited siege engineers and craftsmen to his service. These specialists built enormous machines, towers, catapults, and rams that could batter walls into dust. The Khan understood the value of expertise, often sparing the lives of skilled artisans while others were destroyed. By combining steppe cavalry with advanced siege technology, he created armies that could conquer both open land and walled cities. The collaboration between nomadic horsemen and urban engineers was unusual, yet highly effective. It demonstrated his ability to blend cultures and talents into a single fighting force. Thanks to this fusion, no city felt secure, no matter how high its walls or how strong its gates. Catapults hurled stones, fire, and even diseased bodies into cities. Among the most fearsome tools of Mongol sieges were giant catapults. These engines could launch massive stones that shattered walls, firepots that spread flames, and sometimes even the bodies of the dead. In the grim form of early biological warfare, corpses infected with plague or other diseases were hurled into cities to spread panic and illness. To defenders, these attacks seemed unstoppable, raining destruction from above. Combined with relentless cavalry outside the walls, the pressure was often unbearable. Cities that had withstood ordinary sieges for months or years fell in days under Mongol assault. The use of such weapons showed the Khan's willingness to employ every possible tool of war, from terror to science. For his enemies, even their strongest fortifications became prisons, with death raining down from beyond their walls. He sometimes diverted rivers to flood walled towns. When ordinary tactics failed, Genghis Khan turned to the land itself as a weapon. On several occasions, his forces dug canals or blocked rivers to unleash floods against fortified cities. The sudden surge of water destroyed walls, drowned defenders, and forced panicked evacuations. To enemies, it seemed as though nature itself had joined the Mongols. These tactics required immense labor and engineering skill, yet they reflected the determination of his armies. If a city resisted, he would not leave it alone. He would change the very landscape to bring it down. Such ingenuity revealed his belief that no fortress was truly impregnable. For the besieged, the sound of rushing water was as terrifying as the thunder of hooves. Against the will of Genghis Khan, even rivers were made to obey. His generals commanded armies of tens of thousands with drums and gongs. Coordinating tens of thousands of mounted warriors across vast battlefields required clear communication. The Mongols solved this with a system of signals using drums, gongs, and flags. A single booming note could send an entire wing of cavalry wheeling in a new direction. Gongs set the rhythm for advances or retreats, while banners signaled precise maneuvers. This system allowed the Khan's generals to control battles that covered miles of open ground. To outsiders, the sound of Mongol drums rolling across the plains was a harbinger of doom. To the warriors themselves, it was the heartbeat of their army, uniting scattered riders into a single, coordinated force. Discipline and communication gave them a deadly advantage, making even the most complex maneuvers possible. It was another example of how Genghis Khan's armies combined simplicity with deadly effectiveness. His horse archers could fire in any direction, even backward while riding. The Mongol bow was a masterpiece of steppe technology. Small, powerful, and deadly accurate. In the hands of their skilled riders, it became one of the most fearsome weapons in history. Mongol horsemen trained from childhood to shoot while riding at full gallop. They could fire forward, to the side, or even backward over the tails of their galloping horses. This ability made them unpredictable and nearly impossible to counter. Heavily armored knights or foot soldiers found themselves cut down long before they could close the distance. The endless rain of arrows demoralized opponents who felt as though they were fighting a storm itself. By combining speed, agility, and precision, the Mongol horse archer became the defining symbol of the empire, a warrior who seemed as fluid as the wind sweeping across the plains. Entire kingdoms collapsed in weeks against his lightning strikes. While many medieval wars dragged on for years, Genghis Khan's campaigns often ended in weeks. His armies struck with astonishing speed, overwhelming kingdoms that believed they had months or even years to prepare. Cities that had stood for centuries fell almost overnight. Whole dynasties vanished before neighboring rulers even realized what had happened. This ability to topple states so quickly shocked the world. It was not just his military might, but the sheer pace of his campaigns that set him apart. Against such rapid conquest, resistance often seemed pointless. The collapse of kingdoms became a pattern as the Mongols moved like a storm across continents. For Genghis Khan, it was proof that in war, speed and surprise could be more decisive than sheer numbers. His empire grew not just by force, but by velocity. He conquered more land than Alexander, Napoleon, or Rome. History remembers many great conquerors, but none matched the scale of Genghis Khan. Alexander the Great's empire stretched from Greece to India, and Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, while Rome ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. Yet all of these combined covered less land than the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan's leadership, and continued by his descendants, the Mongols controlled more than 12 million square miles. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history. What makes the achievement even more striking is that it came not from centuries of gradual expansion, but from a single lifetime. In just a few decades, Genghis Khan transformed scattered tribes into a power that redrew the map of the world. His empire left an imprint not just on territory, but on the movement of goods, ideas, and people across continents. His empire stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea. At the height of his conquests, Genghis Khan's empire linked lands that had rarely, if ever, been connected under one rule. In the east, it encompassed Korea and northern China. To the west, it reached across Central Asia to the Caspian Sea. This vast sweep of territory included deserts, mountains, forests, and fertile plains. It brought together cultures as diverse as the Chinese, Persians, Turks, and Russians. For the first time, caravans could travel from East Asia into the heart of the Middle East without leaving the protection of Mongol authority. To stand at the empire's edge was to know that beyond the horizon stretched thousands of miles of land, tied together under the same rule. The sheer geographic scale was unprecedented, and it set the stage for the continued expansion of his descendants, who pushed the borders even further into Europe and the Middle East. At its height, it covered more than 12 million square miles. The numbers themselves are staggering. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched across more than 12 million square miles. This made it larger than the Roman, Byzantine, or Ottoman empires, and nearly double the size of Napoleon's domain. Only the British Empire centuries later would exceed it, and even then, the Mongol lands were connected in one continuous mass, while Britain ruled territories separated by oceans. The immensity of Genghis Khan's empire is hard to imagine. It spanned climates from the frozen Siberian north to the deserts of Central Asia, from the mountains of Persia to the forests of Eastern Europe. Within its borders lived an astonishing variety of peoples, languages, and religions. That such a vast realm could be created in a single generation remains one of history's greatest feats, a scale of conquest the world had never seen before. Nearly half of all humans alive lived within his empire. During the early 13th century, the world's population was far smaller than today. Yet nearly half of all people alive at the time found themselves living within the boundaries of Genghis Khan's empire. This meant that millions of men, women, and children, farmers, merchants, artisans, and nomads all came under his authority, whether directly or through local rulers who pledged loyalty. The sheer demographic reach of his conquests reshaped history. Food, ideas, and technologies moved across cultural boundaries on an unprecedented scale. For people born in distant corners of the world, life was suddenly tied to decisions made on the Mongolian steppe. It is extraordinary to think that one man, once abandoned as a child, could rise to influence the daily lives of so many. His empire was not just vast in land, but immense in human impact. He never built a permanent palace for himself. Despite ruling an empire larger than any before him, Genghis Khan never constructed a grand palace or capital. While other rulers carved their names into stone and raised monumental cities, he remained true to the nomadic traditions of his people. His home was a felt tent, or jur, easily taken down, moved, and rebuilt wherever he traveled. This choice was not simply modesty, but practicality. The Mongol way of life depended on mobility, and even as he commanded millions, Genghis Khan lived much as he had in youth. To his followers, this showed that he was still one of them, not a distant king hiding behind walls. His refusal to settle in luxury reminded his people that power came from strength, discipline, and loyalty, not from marble palaces. In this way, his empire remained rooted in the culture of the open steppe. He lived in a felt tent, even as ruler of the world's largest empire. The felt tent, or yurt, was the traditional home of the Mongols. It was round, portable, and surprisingly warm against the cold winds of the steppe. Even as ruler of an empire that stretched from Asia to Europe, Genghis Khan chose to live in one. This symbolized his connection to his people's traditions and his rejection of excess. While emperors elsewhere surrounded themselves with gold and stone, Genghis Khan's dwelling could be packed up and moved within hours. Inside, it was simple, with rugs, cushions, and the constant smell of fire and food. Visitors who expected palatial halls instead found themselves stepping into a tent, a reminder that the greatest conqueror of his age remained grounded in the life of the steppe. The yurt was not a limitation, but a statement. Mobility was strength, and tradition could endure even amid empire. His diet was simple, mostly meat, milk, and fermented mare's milk. Life on the Mongolian steppe demanded a diet that was practical and sustaining. Genghis Khan, despite his vast power, ate much the same food as his warriors. Meat from sheep, goats, and horses provided protein. Milk from mares, sheep, and cows was consumed fresh or turned into cheese and butter. One drink in particular, fermented mare's milk known as erag, was a staple of Mongol life. Slightly alcoholic and tangy, it was both nourishment and tradition. This diet reflected the realities of nomadic life, where herds were the main resource and farming was nearly impossible. Even as ruler of a global empire, Genghis Khan maintained these habits, sharing the same meals as his men. The simplicity of his food reflected the practicality of his leadership. Nothing wasted, nothing overly indulgent, just what was needed to endure. He valued loyalty above all else in his companions. For Genghis Khan, loyalty was the currency that mattered most. Wealth, status, and noble birth meant little if a man could not be trusted. Many of his closest companions came from humble beginnings, but had proven their dedication through action. Those who stood by him in times of hardship were rewarded with positions of great authority when he rose to power. Betrayal, on the other hand, was punished swiftly and without forgiveness. This harsh balance created an inner circle, bound not by tradition, but by trust. To his soldiers, it was clear loyalty could change your life, bringing rewards greater than birthright ever could. For Genghis Khan, who had been betrayed many times in youth, surrounding himself with unwavering allies was not just a preference, it was survival. Loyalty built the foundation of an empire where personal trust carried the weight of kingdoms. His army was organized in units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. The Mongol army was not a chaotic mass of horsemen, but a carefully structured machine. At its core was a decimal system of organization. Squads of 10 formed the smallest unit. 10 of these made a company of 100, 10 companies formed a regiment of 1,000, and 10 regiments created a tumen of 10,000. This clear hierarchy allowed for precise command and control, even across enormous battlefields. It also created a sense of belonging, as every soldier was part of a small, tightly bonded group, while also being linked to a vast whole. Orders flowed efficiently, and responsibilities were clearly defined. The system was both simple and effective, making the Mongol army one of the most disciplined forces of its time. This organization helped transform nomadic warriors into the unstoppable engine of conquest that reshaped continents. Leaders were promoted for skill, not family connections. Unlike many rulers who appointed relatives or noble elites to command, Genghis Khan broke tradition. In his army, leadership was earned, not inherited. A herder who proved himself in battle could rise to command thousands, while a man of noble blood who faltered could be cast aside. This meritocratic system ensured that his forces were led by the most capable individuals, not the most privileged. It also inspired ordinary soldiers who knew their efforts might be rewarded with real advancement. By stripping away the old aristocratic order, Genghis Khan created a new kind of army, one built on skill, loyalty, and discipline. This approach not only strengthened his forces, but also bound them to him personally, since their rank and success depended on his recognition. In a world still dominated by inherited privilege, his system was revolutionary. His forces used smoke and fire signals to communicate over distance. In the vast open landscapes of Asia, distance could stretch for miles between units of Genghis Khan's army. To coordinate across such space, they turned the sky itself into a message board. Smoke by day and fire by night allowed signals to travel swiftly, relaying orders and warnings across great distances. Combined with messengers on horseback, this system meant that armies spread over enormous territories could still act as a single coordinated force. A plume of smoke rising above a ridge or a sudden flare of fire on the horizon was enough to shift thousands of riders into motion. To their enemies, it seemed as if the Mongols moved with uncanny synchronization, responding faster than should have been possible. For Genghis Khan, communication was as critical as cavalry. These simple signals allowed him to wield his armies like one immense living weapon. He rewarded courage and punished betrayal without hesitation. In Genghis Khan's world, actions mattered more than words. A soldier who displayed bravery on the battlefield could expect recognition, gifts, or promotion. A commander who proved loyal in times of difficulty might find himself entrusted with entire regions to govern. Yet betrayal, cowardice, or desertion brought swift and brutal consequences. There were no second chances for those who broke trust. This balance of reward and punishment created an environment of discipline and certainty. Warriors knew exactly where they stood and what their choices would bring. Loyalty and courage were paths to power, while treachery led only to death or disgrace. In an age when shifting alliances often defined politics, Genghis Khan's clarity stood out. His men could depend on him to honor loyalty, and they knew he would not hesitate to crush betrayal. The certainty itself made his rule stronger. His empire produced one of the earliest systems of passports. To manage his vast realm, Genghis Khan created a system of travel documents that functioned much like early passports. These were called paisa, small tablets often made of metal or wood, stamped with official authority. Carried by merchants, envoys, and officials, they signaled that the bearer traveled under Mongol protection. With a paisa, a traveler could demand fresh horses, food, or shelter from relay stations, ensuring speed and safety. The system not only facilitated trade, but also bound distant regions together under a shared symbol of authority. Long before modern nations adopted passports, Genghis Khan's empire had already invented a way to make mobility official, reliable, and secure. For the people who carried them, these little tablets represented more than paper or wood. They were keys that unlocked safe passage across thousands of miles. Those passports allowed safe travel across vast distances. The paisa were not symbolic tokens, but practical lifelines. With one in hand, a merchant could travel from the Pacific coast to Persia, moving through deserts, mountains, and grasslands without fear. Local officials and garrisons were required to honor the passport, providing protection and assistance. Attacking a traveler carrying a paisa was punishable by death, making them powerful shields. This system created something remarkable, a zone of safety stretching across nearly half the known world. It allowed not just goods, but knowledge, cultures, and even diseases to spread more easily than ever before. For travelers who once faced constant danger, the Mongol system was revolutionary. In many ways, the paisa anticipated the globalized world centuries later, where documents ensured safe passage across borders. Under Genghis Khan, that vision had already begun, carved into small tablets carried in the hands of riders and traders. His campaigns changed the course of Chinese history. China, with its ancient dynasties and vast cities, was one of the greatest prizes of Genghis Khan's ambition. His campaigns against the northern Jin dynasty and later the western Xia brought dramatic change. Walls that had once stood for centuries fell, and cities that had seemed eternal were toppled. In defeating the Jin, he paved the way for his descendants to eventually rule all of China under the Yuan dynasty. The Mongol conquests reshaped Chinese politics, society, and culture for generations. Even the Great Wall, long a symbol of defense, proved unable to stop the relentless advance. For centuries afterward, Chinese history bore the marks of Mongol rule, not only in destruction, but in new exchanges of ideas, technologies, and trade. Genghis Khan did not just raid China, he altered its destiny, weaving it into the broader tapestry of his empire. The Jin dynasty fell to his armies after years of war. The Jin dynasty, which ruled northern China, was one of the most formidable powers of its time. Its wealth, fortified cities, and large armies made it seem untouchable. Yet Genghis Khan's campaigns, relentless and adaptable, slowly wore it down. He combined steppe cavalry with siege technologies borrowed from conquered Chinese engineers, using both speed and patience. City after city fell, until the dynasty itself crumbled. The fall of the Jin was more than a military victory. It was a turning point that showed even the strongest empires could not withstand Mongol power. For Genghis Khan, it was proof that the strategies honed on the steppe could succeed against the wealthiest and most sophisticated states. The conquest of the Jin became one of his greatest achievements, clearing the path for the eventual domination of the whole of China by his descendants. He crushed the Khwarezm Empire after its ruler killed his envoys. Far to the west, the Khwarezm Empire stretched across Persia and Central Asia. At first, Genghis Khan sought peaceful trade, sending envoys to establish diplomatic relations. But the Shah of Khwarezm made a fateful mistake. He executed the ambassadors. To the Khan, this was unforgivable, an attack on the very principle of diplomacy. His response was swift and devastating. He launched a campaign that swept across the empire, dismantling it city by city. Within just a few years, the once powerful Khwarezm realm was gone, erased from the map. The destruction sent shockwaves across the Islamic world and Europe alike, demonstrating the cost of defying him. More than simple conquest, it was a warning. Treaties and envoys must be respected, or ruin would follow. The crushing of Khwarezm became one of the most famous episodes of Mongol expansion. His revenge against Khwarezm was one of history's swiftest conquests. The campaign against Khwarezm stands out not only for its fury, but for its speed. In less than 5 years, an empire stretching across thousands of miles was dismantled. Cities that had thrived for centuries were reduced to ruins, and survivors scattered in all directions. For comparison, many medieval wars lasted decades. Genghis Khan erased a major power in a fraction of that time. His armies struck with relentless coordination, using intelligence networks, siege weapons, and lightning cavalry to overwhelm every defense. To contemporaries, it seemed less like a war and more like a storm sweeping the land. The lesson was clear: defy the Khan, and entire kingdoms could vanish in the blink of a historical eye. This campaign cemented his reputation as a leader whose vengeance was as fast as it was complete. He besieged and destroyed the great city of Nishapur. Among the cities that fell during the war with Khwarezm, Nishapur is remembered with particular horror. Once a center of culture and learning in Persia, it became a symbol of Mongol wrath. Accounts differ on the details, but the city was besieged, captured, and devastated. The destruction was so severe that it echoed in Persian memory for generations. Scholars and artisans were sometimes spared, but the population suffered terribly. For the Mongols, Nishapur was not just a victory, but a warning to others. Resistance would bring ruin. Though the specifics of the massacre remain debated, the fall of Nishapur shows how Genghis Khan's campaigns combined military efficiency with psychological impact. Entire regions feared sharing the same fate, and many surrendered without resistance once news of Nishapur's end spread across the Middle East. Samarkand fell to him after only a few days of resistance. Samarkand, one of the jewels of Central Asia, was famed for its wealth, beauty, and scholarship. Its walls were strong, and its reputation for resilience made it a symbol of regional pride. Yet when Genghis Khan's forces arrived, the city held out for only a few days before falling. The speed of its collapse shocked the Islamic world. Once captured, its artisans, engineers, and scholars were spared and relocated to serve the Mongol Empire. Others were not so fortunate, as the population was scattered. The fall of Samarkand showed the effectiveness of Mongol tactics: intelligence gathering, swift siege techniques, and overwhelming force. For neighboring cities, it was a sobering lesson. If Samarkand could fall in days, no stronghold was truly secure. The conquest of the city became one of Genghis Khan's most dramatic and consequential victories. He once spared artisans and scholars while destroying entire cities. Genghis Khan was ruthless toward enemies who resisted him, yet he made careful choices about whom to spare. When cities were captured, artisans, craftsmen, and scholars were often separated from the rest of the population and kept alive. Skilled weavers, metalworkers, and engineers were relocated to serve in other parts of the empire. Scholars, translators, and doctors were valued as highly as treasures. Entire communities could be destroyed, but their skilled individuals found new roles under Mongol authority. This policy was practical. It strengthened the empire with knowledge and talent, but it also showed his respect for useful abilities. In the eyes of Genghis Khan, knowledge and craftsmanship were worth more than gold, because they created power that lasted long after battles ended. For those with skills, survival sometimes depended not on walls or weapons, but on the usefulness of their craft. He saw knowledge and skill as treasures worth more than gold. Unlike many rulers who hoarded jewels or built palaces, Genghis Khan sought out people who possessed expertise. An artisan who could design a weapon, a scholar who could translate languages, or a merchant who knew distant trade routes. These were the riches he valued most. Gold could be spent, but knowledge could build cities, win wars, and hold empires together. By recognizing the value of talent, he gave his empire an edge that went beyond sheer military force. The spread of ideas and expertise strengthened his administration and created bridges between cultures. It also helped him establish systems, like his postal network and legal code, that endured long after battles were over. In this way, he demonstrated a kind of wisdom, that true wealth was not only in material riches, but in the minds and hands of people who could shape the future. His generals were often given entire regions to govern. As the empire expanded, it became impossible for Genghis Khan to rule everything directly. Instead, he appointed his most trusted generals to govern conquered lands. These men, often drawn from humble origins, had proven their loyalty and skill on the battlefield. Now, they were tasked with managing cities, collecting tribute, and ensuring order across vast regions. In return, they enjoyed wealth and authority far greater than they might ever have imagined in their youth. This practice created a system of governance where loyalty was rewarded not just with spoils of war, but with real responsibility. It also spread Mongol influence deep into local societies, as generals and their families became part of the ruling fabric. The empire was held together not just by conquest, but by this delegation of power, which gave capable men a stake in the survival of the realm. His empire relied on strict discipline among its soldiers. The Mongol army was not merely a collection of raiders, it was a disciplined machine. Orders were to be obeyed without question, and loyalty was absolute. Even small infractions could bring severe punishment. Soldiers who abandoned their units or disobeyed commands faced harsh consequences, sometimes death. This discipline was one of the reasons the Mongol armies could perform complex maneuvers with such precision. Every warrior knew his place in the decimal system of organization, from squads of 10 to divisions of 10,000. Trust in one another and in their leaders allowed them to act as a single body. For Genghis Khan, discipline was the line between chaos and empire. Without it, his forces would have been just another band of raiders. With it, they became one of the most effective military forces the world has ever known. Desertion in battle was punished by death. For the Mongol warrior, there was no greater crime than desertion. In battle, abandoning one's comrades or fleeing from the enemy was met with the harshest punishment: execution. This rule instilled fear, but also ensured loyalty. Soldiers fought not only for glory or spoils, but because they knew their survival depended on standing firm with their unit. The policy reflected Genghis Khan's absolute belief in discipline. A single deserter could cause panic and unravel a formation, so he allowed no tolerance for such behavior. The result was an army where men trusted that those beside them would not falter. Though severe, the law created stability and cohesion, turning a collection of tribes into a unified force. In the brutal world of steppe warfare, such certainty could mean the difference between victory and defeat. He often ordered spies into enemy cities long before his armies arrived. Long before the thunder of hooves announced the Mongol cavalry, spies were already at work inside enemy cities. Disguised as traders, wanderers, or even refugees, they gathered information about defenses, supplies, and morale. Sometimes they spread rumors to weaken confidence or to exaggerate the size of the approaching Mongol army. By the time Genghis Khan's forces appeared on the horizon, he often knew more about the city than its own defenders. This intelligence made his campaigns unusually effective. Cities were taken faster, ambushes were avoided, and resistance was weakened before battles even began. The use of espionage shows that Genghis Khan valued cunning as much as courage. He understood that wars were not won only with swords and arrows, but also with knowledge, deception, and preparation. In this way, he was as much a strategist as a warrior. His men sometimes used fire arrows to terrify defenders. During sieges, the Mongols often relied on psychological weapons as much as physical ones. Fire arrows dipped in oil and set aflame were launched over city walls, turning the night sky into a terrifying shower of sparks. To defenders, the sight was as alarming as the flames themselves, which could set rooftops and supplies ablaze. Even when damage was limited, the spectacle spread fear and chaos. Combined with catapults and siege towers, fire arrows created the impression of unstoppable destruction raining from above. For soldiers inside the walls, sleepless nights filled with smoke and fire weakened their will to resist. For Genghis Khan, these arrows were not just weapons but messages. No wall was high enough, no gate strong enough to stop his relentless advance. Cities that resisted were sometimes razed to send a message. Not every city that faced Genghis Khan chose to surrender. Those that resisted often paid a heavy price. Some were destroyed so thoroughly that they vanished from history, remembered only in chronicles of destruction. This harsh policy was not only revenge, it was calculated. By razing a city, Genghis Khan sent a message to all others. Resistance meant ruin. The lesson spread quickly. News of obliterated towns traveled faster than his armies, convincing many to surrender without a fight. Though brutal, this strategy reduced the number of drawn-out sieges and minimized losses among his own men. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale, teaching whole regions to submit before the Mongol banners even appeared. For those who witnessed it, the memory endured for generations, shaping how people responded to the name of Genghis Khan. He left behind networks of governors to rule newly conquered lands. Conquering territory was only the first step. Holding it required administration. Genghis Khan established networks of governors and officials to manage newly conquered regions. These men were responsible for collecting tribute, enforcing laws, and maintaining order. Many were locals who pledged loyalty, while others were Mongol generals or trusted allies. The system ensured that conquered lands were not left to chaos once the army moved on. Instead, they were integrated into the larger empire. This practical approach allowed the Mongols to control territories thousands of miles away, from Chinese provinces to Persian cities. By delegating authority, Genghis Khan ensured that his empire did not dissolve into disorder, but remained a functioning, interconnected realm. He encouraged trade and communication across his empire. For Genghis Khan, conquest was not just about winning battles. Once regions were brought under his control, he encouraged the flow of goods and information. Merchants received protection. Travelers carried Paisa passports, and relay stations spread across trade routes. Caravans moved silk, spices, and precious metals, but they also carried stories, technologies, and beliefs. This exchange turned the empire into a living bridge between civilizations. Communication across such vast distances had rarely been possible before, but under the Mongols, it flourished. By encouraging both trade and communication, Genghis Khan transformed his empire into more than just a patchwork of conquered lands. It became a single network, connecting cultures that had once been strangers. The effects rippled far beyond his lifetime, helping to shape the world that came after. He admired strong leadership in both friends and enemies. Genghis Khan was not blind to the qualities of his rivals. While he demanded loyalty from his followers, he also respected strength when he saw it in others. A courageous enemy commander might be spared, not out of mercy alone, but because Genghis valued ability above enmity. This openness allowed him to recruit defeated leaders into his service, turning foes into allies. He admired discipline, bravery, and cleverness, whether displayed by his sworn companions or by those who stood against him. It was a practical attitude. Talent, once recognized, could be redirected toward building his empire. By showing respect even to his adversaries, he reinforced the idea that greatness could transcend tribal lines. To his men, it was a reminder that their leader was not guided only by vengeance, but also by a sharp eye for skill, no matter where it was found. He recruited skilled craftsmen from all corners of Asia. Wherever his armies marched, Genghis Khan sought out artisans. Blacksmiths, weavers, stonemasons, and jewelers were often spared while others perished. These craftsmen were resettled in new cities or placed in the service of Mongol leaders. Their work enriched the empire, producing weapons, armor, textiles, and goods that strengthened trade. Some were moved thousands of miles from their homelands, carrying their traditions with them. The spread of artisans helped blend cultures, creating hybrid styles and techniques that might never have existed otherwise. To Genghis Khan, this practice was as important as conquest itself. While war brought destruction, the gathering of skilled workers built foundations for the future. The empire became a crossroads not only for armies, but also for art, craft, and invention, woven together by the hands of those whom the Khan had chosen to preserve. His empire introduced Chinese gunpowder weapons to the West. Among the many technologies carried westward by the Mongols was the secret of gunpowder. Invented in China, it had been used for fireworks and primitive weapons. Under Mongol rule, its military potential spread far beyond Asia. Chinese engineers accompanied Mongol armies, bringing with them early gunpowder weapons such as fire lances and explosive projectiles. These ideas reached the Middle East and eventually Europe, where they transformed warfare. Cannons, firearms, and explosives all trace part of their lineage to these early encounters. Genghis Khan himself may not have fully understood how revolutionary gunpowder would become, but his empire provided the pathway. In linking East and West, he inadvertently helped ignite a technological transformation that changed the course of history. The thunder of Mongol hooves carried with it not just armies, but the sparks of a new age of warfare. He relied on astrologers and shamans for advice. Though pragmatic and disciplined, Genghis Khan lived in a world where the unseen held great influence. Astrologers and shamans often advised him, interpreting omens, the stars, and the will of the spirits. Before major campaigns, rituals were performed to seek favorable outcomes. Shamans might bless the army, predict victory, or warn of dangers ahead. These practices reflected the spiritual traditions of the steppe, where the sky, earth, and ancestors were deeply revered. For the Khan, such counsel was not dismissed, even if strategy and discipline ultimately guided his decisions. By honoring shamans, he also honored the beliefs of his people, strengthening their sense of unity. In his court, the voices of spiritual leaders mingled with generals and advisors, blending the mystical with the practical in shaping the destiny of the Mongol Empire. He respected omens, but trusted discipline above superstition. Omens mattered to Genghis Khan, but they were never the sole guide to his actions. He listened to shamans, observed signs in the natural world, and acknowledged the spiritual traditions of his people. Yet when it came to war, discipline and preparation always outweighed superstition. If an omen promised victory but his scouts reported danger, he trusted the scouts. If rituals suggested caution but his armies were ready, he pressed forward. This balance reveals a leader who honored tradition without being bound by it. He gave his people the comfort of rituals but never surrendered control to chance. In this way, he walked a careful line between belief and reason. For his followers, it showed that their Khan respected their culture, yet also embodied the clarity and decisiveness needed to command an empire. His troops used advanced saddles and stirrups to fight with precision. The Mongol advantage in cavalry was not just training, but also equipment. Their saddles were designed to give stability, with high front and back supports that allowed riders to remain balanced, even during sharp turns or at full gallop. Stirrups gave them the ability to stand while riding, freeing their hands for archery with remarkable accuracy. These innovations turned every mounted warrior into a mobile fortress, able to shoot in nearly any direction without losing balance. Compared to other armies of the time, whose cavalry often fought with lances or swords, the Mongols wielded bows with a precision that seemed impossible. Their technology amplified their natural skill, making the bond between rider and horse nearly seamless. In combination with their discipline, the saddles and stirrups became quiet tools of conquest, small details that helped shape the fate of continents. The Mongol bow could pierce armor at long distances. At the heart of Mongol warfare was the composite bow. Made of wood, horn, and sinew, it was a marvel of craftsmanship. Despite its relatively small size, it packed immense power, able to pierce armor at distances greater than most European longbows. Mongol warriors trained from childhood to use it, drawing with incredible strength and accuracy. In battle, volleys of arrows rained down on enemies long before they could close the distance. Armored knights, once thought nearly invincible, found themselves vulnerable to the weapon's force. The bow's design also made it well-suited for horseback, compact enough to handle while still devastating in range. This combination of technology and training made the Mongol archer one of the most lethal warriors in history. The sound of their bowstrings snapping in unison was the prelude to countless victories across Asia and beyond. His cavalry tactics influenced warfare for centuries after. The mobility and tactics of Genghis Khan's cavalry left a long legacy. Feigned retreats, rapid flanking maneuvers, and coordinated arrow volleys became lessons studied by armies long after the Mongols were gone. European knights, Middle Eastern commanders, and even later Asian dynasties adapted elements of his strategies. The emphasis on speed, discipline, and adaptability changed how wars were fought. Armies that once relied on heavy infantry or slow-moving cavalry had to rethink their approaches when facing Mongol-style tactics. Even in modern times, military historians analyze the precision and coordination of the Mongol army. Their campaigns are seen as examples of how discipline and strategy can triumph over sheer numbers. Genghis Khan's influence on the art of war reached far beyond his empire's borders, shaping battlefields for generations to come. He valued intelligence networks as much as weapons. For Genghis Khan, victory began long before the battle itself. Spies, scouts, and informants formed an intelligence network that fed him information about enemies near and far. Knowledge of terrain, supplies, morale, and internal politics allowed him to strike with uncanny precision. Sometimes these networks were built on fear, with locals forced to provide information. Other times they relied on loyalty, as merchants and envoys passed along details from foreign courts. To the Khan, intelligence was as vital as swords and bows. A well-placed spy could save thousands of lives by preventing ambushes or revealing weaknesses. This emphasis on information made his campaigns faster, more efficient, and more devastating than those of his rivals. It was an early demonstration of a principle still true today, that wars are often won by those who know the most. He placed spies inside the courts of his enemies. Beyond the battlefield, Genghis Khan extended his intelligence networks into the very courts of rival rulers. Envoys, merchants, and disguised agents carried not only trade goods but also secrets. They listened to political debates, gauged the strength of alliances, and sometimes even influenced decisions from within. By the time his armies marched, he often knew his enemies' weaknesses better than they did themselves. This infiltration gave him a decisive edge, allowing him to anticipate movements, exploit divisions, and strike where resistance was weakest. To his foes, it often seemed as though the Mongols could see the future. In reality, it was the patient work of spies and informants, directed by a leader who valued information as highly as victory itself. For Genghis Khan, knowledge was not just power, it was the key to empire. His armies sometimes faked larger numbers with campfires. One of the simplest tricks in the Mongol arsenal was also one of the most effective. At night, when armies set up camp, Genghis Khan's soldiers lit far more fires than their numbers required. To enemy scouts watching from a distance, the horizon seemed alive with flames, suggesting a force many times larger than reality. The illusion was enough to sap courage, spread rumors, and sometimes convince entire cities to surrender without a fight. This use of deception reflected the Khan's understanding that battles could be won in the mind long before swords clashed. The brilliance of the tactic was its simplicity. No extra men were needed, only the clever use of light against darkness. For those who faced the Mongols, even the night sky seemed to conspire with them, hiding truth behind a curtain of flickering fire. Prisoners were sometimes forced to march with dummies to inflate army size. In some campaigns, captured enemies were not executed but instead used in another way. They were forced to march alongside the Mongols carrying dummies or flags, creating the illusion of a vast army. From afar, defenders could not tell that the figures on the horizon were not real warriors. This psychological trick played into the fear that already surrounded the Khan's reputation. Faced with what appeared to be overwhelming numbers, resistance often melted away. To Genghis Khan, such tactics were simply efficient. Why risk lives in a costly siege when fear could win the battle for him? The use of decoys shows his deep understanding of human psychology. He knew that perception could be as decisive as reality. Armies fought not only with weapons, but also with the images planted in the minds of their enemies. He fought campaigns across deserts, mountains, and frozen rivers. Few environments could stop the advance of Genghis Khan's armies. His campaigns spanned the burning sands of Central Asia, the icy winters of Russia, and the towering ranges of Persia and China. Where other forces faltered in harsh conditions, the Mongols adapted. They crossed frozen rivers in winter, using the ice as natural highways. They carried supplies through deserts, pushing across barren stretches that seemed impossible for survival. Their resilience came from their upbringing on the unforgiving steppe, where extreme weather was a way of life. For enemies, there was often no refuge. The desert, the mountains, and the winter snows that had once served as natural defenses now became pathways for Mongol invasion. The ability to fight and win in any environment made the empire's expansion feel unstoppable, as if no corner of the earth was beyond its reach. Winter campaigns gave him surprise victories where no one expected attack. Most medieval armies avoided fighting in winter. Cold, snow, and scarce supplies made campaigns dangerous. Genghis Khan, however, saw opportunity where others saw only hardship. He launched winter offensives when enemies least expected them. Rivers froze solid, becoming open roads for cavalry. Snow-covered landscapes offered concealment. Cities that thought themselves safe until spring were suddenly surrounded by Mongol horsemen. The shock of such attacks often broke morale before battles began. For the Khan, using winter as a weapon showed his willingness to defy convention. His soldiers, hardened by life on the steppe, endured the cold better than most opponents. By fighting when others would not, he turned nature itself into an ally. To his enemies, the appearance of Mongol banners in the dead of winter seemed impossible, yet it became a terrifying reality that few could withstand. He demanded total loyalty, but rewarded it with riches and land. Loyalty to Genghis Khan was absolute. His followers were expected to obey without hesitation and to place the needs of the empire above all else. Yet this loyalty was not taken for granted. It was rewarded. Victorious warriors received spoils of war, including gold, livestock, and sometimes land. Families of fallen soldiers were cared for, reinforcing the idea that service to the Khan brought security as well as glory. By balancing strict demands with generous rewards, he created a system where devotion to him was both a duty and a path to prosperity. This approach turned loyalty into the glue that held together tribes from across the steppe and beyond. For many men, serving Genghis Khan was not simply survival. It was the surest way to achieve a life of wealth, honor, and lasting legacy. He shared spoils of war fairly with his soldiers. Unlike many rulers who hoarded treasures, Genghis Khan distributed the wealth of conquest among his warriors. After battles, loot was gathered and divided according to a strict system. Every soldier received a share, no matter how humble his rank. This fairness set him apart from leaders who enriched only the noble elite. Soldiers came to trust that their service would bring tangible rewards, making them fiercely loyal. The system also reduced resentment, as victories benefited the many rather than just a few at the top. For men who had once lived in poverty, the chance to share in the spoils of empire was life-changing. By making wealth communal, Genghis Khan ensured that his army fought not only for duty, but also for the promise of real, shared prosperity. This fairness helped fuel the unstoppable momentum of his conquests. He once ordered treasure melted down into ingots to prevent disputes. After one particularly rich conquest, disputes arose among his generals over the division of treasure. To prevent conflict, Genghis Khan made a surprising decision. He ordered all the gold and silver melted down into uniform ingots. By transforming wealth into identical bars, he removed the causes of jealousy. No man could claim a better prize, and distribution became equal and orderly. The act was both practical and symbolic. It demonstrated that unity mattered more than luxury, and that discipline outweighed greed. In an empire held together by loyalty, internal disputes were as dangerous as foreign enemies. By controlling how wealth was managed, Genghis Khan reminded his commanders that riches were a tool of empire, not its foundation. The gesture ensured fairness while reinforcing the idea that order, not indulgence, was the true strength of Mongol power. He believed empire was built on discipline, not wealth. For Genghis Khan, the foundation of his empire was never gold or jewels, but the discipline of his people. Wealth could vanish, cities could fall, but discipline endured. His soldiers trained relentlessly, obeyed without hesitation, and accepted strict punishments when rules were broken. This discipline allowed them to perform maneuvers that seemed impossible to outsiders, moving as one across the battlefield. Even in times of great conquest, when riches poured in, he reminded his followers that luxury could weaken them. He lived simply himself, in a felt tent, eating the same food as his warriors. By doing so, he set an example. Wealth was useful, but discipline was essential. It was this belief that allowed him to turn scattered tribes into an empire, not riches, but order, loyalty, and the unbreakable will of disciplined men. He sometimes pardoned enemies who impressed him with bravery. Though feared for his ruthlessness, Genghis Khan could also be unexpectedly merciful. When enemies showed extraordinary courage or skill, he sometimes chose to pardon them rather than destroy them. Such men were often recruited into his service, given positions of command, or made governors of conquered lands. To the Khan, bravery was a resource as valuable as loyalty, and he was unwilling to waste it. These pardons were not acts of sentiment, but of practicality. By sparing the worthy, he strengthened his own ranks while weakening those of his enemies. The policy also sent a message: the Khan was ruthless to the disobedient, but generous to the brave. For warriors facing him, the possibility of survival through valor gave both fear and hope. In this balance, he demonstrated that even mercy could serve as a tool of empire. His empire made the first great bridge between East and West. The conquests of Genghis Khan created more than just an empire. They created a bridge across continents. For the first time in history, trade, communication, and travel linked China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe under a single system of rule. Ideas flowed in both directions. Paper, gunpowder, and silk reached the West, while medicine, astronomy, and philosophies traveled eastward. The Mongol peace made this exchange possible, securing routes that had once been perilous. The world became more interconnected than ever before, setting the stage for future global history. Though born in the windswept steppes of Mongolia, Genghis Khan reshaped the destiny of civilizations thousands of miles away. His empire was not only the largest land empire in history, it was also the first to knit together the distant corners of East and West into one vast network. His death in 1227 remains shrouded in mystery. The end of Genghis Khan's life came in 1227, but the details of his passing remain uncertain. Unlike many rulers whose deaths were recorded in detail, his was kept deliberately secret. Chroniclers give conflicting accounts, and his followers did little to clarify the truth. What is clear is that he died during his campaign against the Western Xia, still leading his armies in the field. The silence surrounding his death was intentional, preserving the aura of his power and preventing enemies from exploiting the news. Even in death, mystery clung to the great conqueror, leaving later generations to wonder how such a formidable figure finally met his end. Legends say he was thrown from his horse during campaign. One tale claims that Genghis Khan's death came in a simple, almost mundane way. He was thrown from his horse while on campaign. For a man whose entire life was bound to the saddle, it is a strangely poetic possibility. The horse had carried him to countless victories, and yet, in the end, it may have betrayed him. Such a death would fit the harsh realities of the steppe, where even the greatest warrior could not escape the risks of daily life. Whether true or not, the story lingers, reminding us that even the most unstoppable leaders remain vulnerable to the smallest accidents of fate. Other tales claim he was killed in battle against the Western Xia. Another story holds that Genghis Khan met his end in combat against the Western Xia. According to this version, he fell during the fighting, struck down while pursuing victory. If so, his death would have been in keeping with his life, not in the choirs of a palace, but on the battlefield, surrounded by war. For his followers, such a tale carried a kind of honor, framing their leader's death as a warrior's end. Yet no record confirms it. The story exists as part of the tangle of rumor and legend that has always surrounded his final days, where truth blends with myth in the fog of history. His body was carried back to Mongolia in secrecy. What happened after his death is as mysterious as the cause itself. Chroniclers say that his body was returned to Mongolia, carried by his loyal followers. The procession moved in secrecy, taking no chances that the burial would be discovered. The journey itself became legendary, marked not by celebration, but by silence. The decision reflected his lifelong need for control. Even in death, his resting place would not become a target for enemies, looters, or rival clans. The secrecy only deepened the sense of awe surrounding his name. His body vanished into the steppes, leaving behind no monument, only the empire he had forged. His funeral escort killed everyone who saw the procession. One of the most chilling legends surrounding Genghis Khan's burial tells of his funeral escort killing every person who crossed their path. Farmers, travelers, and even whole villages were said to have been wiped out to ensure that no one could follow or reveal the burial site. Whether this is truth or myth is impossible to know, but the story persists, adding to the aura of secrecy. It suggests that his loyal followers went to extraordinary lengths to protect their Khan even after his death. Such tales, passed down through centuries, transformed his funeral into an event cloaked in both reverence and fear. Horses trampled his grave to hide it forever. Another legend describes how, once the burial was complete, the funeral escort ordered horses to trample the ground flat. The soil was churned until no trace of digging remained, leaving nothing for the curious to discover. Some say trees were planted over the site to disguise it further. The ritual of concealment was in keeping with the Mongol way, where secrecy and security were valued as much as ceremony. The idea of horses erasing the grave adds a fittingly steppe-like touch. The animals that had carried him to empire also helped to raise his final resting place, leaving only mystery behind. To this day, no one knows where he is buried. Despite centuries of searching, the burial place of Genghis Khan has never been found. Archaeologists, adventurers, and even entire expeditions have scoured Mongolia for clues, but the grave remains hidden. This enduring absence adds to the aura of his legend. Unlike other rulers whose tombs became monuments, his resting place became a secret that outlasted empires. In a sense, this has preserved his memory in a way no monument could, not as a ruin to be visited, but as a mystery to be wondered at. His grave, if it exists, is as elusive as the man himself once was on the battlefield. Some believe his tomb lies near the sacred Burkhan Khaldun mountain. Among the many theories, one of the most enduring is that Genghis Khan was buried near Burkhan Khaldun, a sacred mountain in Mongolia. This mountain had deep spiritual significance for him. He once credited it with saving his life in youth, and he declared it holy for his people. To be buried there would have tied his spirit to a place of protection and reverence. The region has been closed to excavation, preserved as a sacred site, which only fuels speculation. Pilgrims still visit the mountain, and many Mongols believe their great ancestor rests somewhere on its slopes. Others believe it is hidden beneath a river or lake. Another tradition claims his grave was concealed beneath water. According to this version, a river was diverted to cover his tomb, or perhaps a lake was chosen as the final hiding place. Such a burial would have been nearly impossible to disturb, forever protected by the natural barrier of flowing water. This story reflects the lengths to which his followers were said to have gone to keep his resting place secret. Whether beneath earth or beneath water, the grave of Genghis Khan has remained untouched for nearly 800 years, an enigma waiting beneath the surface of history. The mystery of his resting place remains one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. What is certain is that Genghis Khan's burial site has never been found, and perhaps never will be. The secrecy was so complete, the legends so tangled, that the truth may be lost forever. And yet, The very absence has become part of his story. While other rulers are remembered through tombs and monuments, he is remembered through mystery. His resting place remains an unsolved puzzle, drawing curiosity from historians, explorers, and dreamers alike. In this way, his legacy continues not only in the vast empire he built, but also in the silence of the steppes, where his grave may lie hidden, untouched, and eternal. And so, our long journey across the steppe draws to a close. We have traced the story of Genghis Khan from his fragile childhood through the thunder of his armies, through the rise of an empire that stretched across continents, and finally into the silence of his hidden grave. His life was one of contrasts, of loyalty and betrayal, of destruction and creation, of mystery and certainty. What lingers most, perhaps, is not only the scale of his conquests, but the endurance of his legend. The Mongol horsemen may be gone, but the world they shaped still echoes with their influence. Trade routes, technologies, and even the mingling of cultures bear traces of the empire he forged. And yet, the greatest conqueror of the steppe remains elusive even in death, his final resting place hidden beneath the vast horizons he once commanded. As you drift into rest, let your thoughts ride out into that endless grassland, where the wind carries whispers of history and where mysteries lie just beyond the edge of knowing. The story of Genghis Khan is both complete and unfinished, a reminder that history is as much about questions as it is about answers. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, you can like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a comment to share your thoughts. It helps us bring you more stories, told gently, to accompany your nights. But for now, close your eyes. Let the day slip quietly away and allow yourself to drift into sleep. Another story awaits in the next video, when you're ready. Good night.